Hello and welcome to another episode of the Talking Europe vlog series. My name is Dioyssis Dimitrakopoulos. I hold the Jean Monnet Chair in Parliamentary Democracy and European Integration at Birkbeck. And in that context, I have invited Conor Kelly, who's a doctoral student in the Department of Politics. He's writing a doctoral dissertation on the preferences of Northern Ireland political parties, Northern Irish political parties on European integration, to talk to us about a project in which he has been involved, which strictly speaking is not a backpack project. It's a project on the issue of unification referendum in Ireland that has been conducted by colleagues over at UCL's Constitution Unit next to us. And this is an issue that is one of the several byproducts of Brexit, which was the subject of the previous Talking Europe episode, as regular viewers will know. It is a byproduct of Brexit in two senses. First of all, the Good Friday Agreement of 1998 is to a very large extent couched in the full utilization of the four freedoms that come with full membership of the European Union, which is no longer the case for Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. But it is also one that has been affected by the decision of a majority in the UK to withdraw from the EU, despite the wishes of a clear majority in Northern Ireland. So in that context, I have invited Conor to talk to us about this project, which, as I said earlier, is conducted over at UCL's Constitution Unit by a group that has been convened specifically about this issue. So the first question to Conor is to tell us a little bit more about this particular group and the main objective that they have.
Sure. So thanks for having me on. I'm delighted to do this. So yeah, as you said, I work as the research assistant and the project manager for the working group on unification referendums on the island of Ireland. It's led by Dr. Alan Rennick, who is the deputy director of the Constitution Unit. But the working group consists of experts from politics, law, sociology, history, and it draws on expertise from universities in Northern Ireland, in the Republic of Ireland, in the United Kingdom, and actually in the United States. And the purpose of the group is, as you've said, to examine how any future referendums on the constitutional status of Northern Ireland would be designed and conducted. So really whether Northern Ireland should remain part of the United Kingdom or whether it should join with the rest of Ireland to form a united Ireland. So it's really important to say that the project isn't looking at and doesn't take any views on whether or not a united Ireland would be desirable, or even if a border poll should be held. It's trying to look at this question in an impartial manner and an academic manner. Because this is a really important issue, as you said, for a couple of reasons. People are talking about a border poll in Ireland. One of those reasons is Brexit. As you've explained, Brexit led to an increased amount of discussion around the constitutional future of Northern Ireland, but also Brexit showed, I think all sides of the Brexit debate will agree, that if you don't have a sufficient amount of planning and preparation for how a referendum should take place and what should come afterwards, that you can end up in quite a thorny predicament afterwards, because people can't agree on what the process should be and what people were voting on. So this type of referendum is, as you said, laid out in the Belfast Good Friday Agreement of 1998, which most people see as settling the constitutional debate in Northern Ireland, or at least bringing Northern Irish political parties and the Northern Irish political process away from conflict and into purely constitutional, peaceful political debate. And in that Good Friday Agreement and in the Northern Ireland Act of 1998, which accompanies it, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland is obliged under certain conditions to call a poll, and I know we'll get into this later. But because no one has really done the real thinking into what would happen after that, what would happen at the point at which the Secretary of State calls a poll, this team of academics felt it was incumbent on them to draft a report which looked at all of the different legal and political processes that would be set in train by a referendum being called.
Okay, one of the aspects of the interim report that has been produced by this group of authors relates to the state of opinion on referendums on the issue of unification. So my first question is, what did the public consultation that you've run show?
Yeah, so lots of opinion polling has been conducted over the years, particularly in Northern Ireland, on what people think about the unification issue, because it's actually a really key component of whether or not a border poll is ever called. The Secretary of State is obliged under certain conditions, namely if a majority appears likely, to call a referendum. So people always keep a close eye on opinion polling. We commissioned not a opinion poll, not a sort of quantitative opinion poll. We commissioned a public consultation, which really wanted to drill down into what people feel around questions of a border poll and questions of a united Ireland in Northern Ireland. So we're not just counting how many people are in favour of unity. We were really looking at like how they feel about different issues that would come into play. So we asked the public in Northern Ireland what their hopes and fears were around a referendum, what their hopes and fears were around a united Ireland. Are there ways that you can overcome those fears? What could we communicate to the government around getting over some of those hopes and fears? And also we asked them, did they have any questions that they needed answers to before a referendum was ever called? So if there were to be a referendum, what are the sort of burning questions that the public have? We got a really good response. We had nearly 1,400 responses. It's probably not surprising that the majority of the responses came from people who would describe themselves as Irish nationalists or identify as being Irish, and broadly speaking would be in favour of Irish unity. They talked about some of the fears and hopes they had around this process, hopes for a united Ireland, that it would be a more equitable society, that the political process would be smoother, and that it would be one step towards a sort of reconciliation on the island of Ireland between the different traditions that occupy the island. They also had a lot of fears around the process, fears around, how a referendum would be triggered and making sure that when the referendum was called that it was fair to all sides. Pardon me. We also did get some responses from people who identify as unionists and identify as being British. They obviously have a lot of fears around a referendum being needlessly called early, or sort of talk after Brexit of a referendum needlessly leading to a border poll, which they feel would be quite a decisive exercise. And they also have fears around, if a united Ireland were ever to happen, how the rights of minorities, British and unionist people would be a minority in a united Ireland, how their rights would be protected, and sort of fears around how they would be treated in a new state. We also had a significant amount of people respond who identified as neither unionist nor nationalist, so neither in favour or against the united Ireland. And these people brought up a variety of different issues that they wanted answers to. So how would the education system work? What would an all-Ireland healthcare system look like? What would happen with pensions? What would happen with welfare systems? Those sort of things. They were particularly interested in those issues. But I think it's really important to say that across the public consultation, nationalists and unionists also brought up issues like that as well. So people have quite ingrained long-standing hopes and fears around this process, but they also have thoughts about the nitty-gritty issues that would need to be addressed. What everyday life would look like if a referendum were to be called, what the campaign would look like, but also what a united Ireland would look like in practice.
If I could ask a follow-up question, was there significant overlap in the kind of issues that the various groups that you mentioned actually raised?
Yeah, there are a couple of issues that are common across all of those different communities, nationalists, unionists, and other. I'd say one that came up a lot, and that people are probably, who are following this debate quite closely, are already aware of, is healthcare. So Northern Ireland, obviously, as part of the United Kingdom, has the NHS. There's a Northern Irish NHS. In the Republic of Ireland, there's a mixed system, a mixed private and public system. There has been talk about moving towards a fully or a more public system in the Republic. But people naturally have a lot of questions about how that would operate in United Ireland. People don't want to lose access to free healthcare and don't want to go into a system where they might need to purchase private healthcare. People have different thoughts about that. Obviously, nationalists are more inclined to say, well, we should have an all-Ireland national healthcare system, and unionists are more inclined to say, well, we don't have that, so I'll stick with the NHS for now. Thank you very much. But that is an issue that came up. And as I said, other issues like education, European Union membership, those sort of things were brought up by different groups in different ways.
Okay. The second question is, what are or what could be the conditions under which a poll would be called?
Yeah, so as we've both been saying, the referendum on Northern Ireland's constitutional status can be called by the Secretary of State, who's basically the British government minister who's in charge of Northern Ireland. There are two ways that a poll could be called. One, the Secretary of State has a discretionary power to call a poll whenever he or she wants. So, tomorrow morning, a Secretary of State could come out and say that I'm calling a referendum on Northern Ireland's constitutional status. Probably very unlikely that's going to happen, but they have that power. The second way that a border poll could be called is the Northern Ireland Act and the Good Friday Agreement says that if it appears likely that a majority would vote for unity, so that is 50% plus one. If it appears likely that would happen, then the Secretary of State must call a border poll. As a matter of law, they have to call a border poll in that scenario. So we're seeing lots of opinion polling in Scotland that's showing a majority for independence, but Boris Johnson's not minded to call a referendum. If that situation were replicated in Northern Ireland tomorrow, the Secretary of State would have to call a referendum because it appears that evidence is showing a majority for unity. So there are a couple of different ways that a Secretary of State might assess whether or not there is a majority for unity. So one that most people are probably familiar with that I've already discussed is opinion polling. But it's important to remember that opinion polls in Northern Ireland are showing quite varied results around this, depending on the methodology that's used, whether the poll is online or offline, you get quite different results. So it's not that straightforward. Other ways that you could look at whether or not there is support for United Ireland is votes cast in an election or the amount of seats won by a party at an election. So people are probably aware in Northern Ireland the political parties are divided along community lines. So there are two major political parties, Sinn Féin and the SDLP, which broadly speaking support Irish unity. So some people might argue you could look at the amount of votes that those parties won or seats that those parties won in order to assess whether or not there was a majority in the population for Irish unity. Related to that, you could have a vote in the Assembly. So Northern Irish Assembly members could have a vote asking the Secretary of State to trigger a poll. You could also have some qualitative evidence, so that the Secretary of State could speak to experts on the ground or the public on the ground in order to sort of make up his or her mind as to whether or not there was a majority there. And finally, you could look at demographic data. So broadly speaking, there's a correlation between religious and national background and whether or not you're in favour of Irish unity. It's certainly the case historically that Catholics and nationalists favoured Irish unity, Protestant British nationalists favoured the Union. So what we say is that demographic data is probably not the best gauge of public opinion. Demography is not destiny. It could form the backdrop of what the Secretary of State is looking at, but it shouldn't be determinative. You can't deduce from someone's religion how they vote, and it'd be quite a dangerous concept to roll that out. With regards to all these other competing pieces of evidence, what we say is that you can't specify that one is the absolute gold standard of measuring public opinion. You can't say either that we might be years away from a border poll being triggered. We don't really know the context of the time that the poll would be called, so it's hard to sort of give a precise weight to say polls are worth more than election results or vice versa. It's difficult to do that. So what we say is that the Secretary of State would need to balance all relevant ways of assessing public opinion, and it's an important legal point that the Secretary of State needs to take into account all relevant information that's at hand to him or her. in order to make this decision.
Okay. Final question. Would you be able to present to us one or two likely referendum configurations, which, as we know, is a very thorny issue for any referendum, but with a focus in this case on Northern Ireland?
Yeah, so it is particularly challenging to look at the sequencing of how everything would happen in Northern Ireland for a couple of different reasons. So obviously there's in all likelihood going to be two referendums, one north, one south of the border. It's also difficult to sort of map out the process in terms of when would the substantive sort of deal, the United Ireland, the shape of the state, be on the table. Would that happen before the vote and people would vote on the details of United Ireland, or would the vote happen and then you work out the details, sort of what happened with Brexit? And there's a couple of different considerations that you have to keep in mind in order to sort of maximize input from the different communities. So namely the unionist community, you might say that you need to settle the issue before you talk about the shape, because obviously unionists are not going to want to talk about the shape of United Ireland before the vote takes place. But you also want a sort of informed choice. So you want voters to go into the ballot box knowing what's going to happen if they vote in favour of change. So we looked at a variety of different ways you could do this, having one referendum, having two referendums, having votes on the principle, and then having votes on the detail and the substance, and having a vote maybe to trigger a process that led to a second, more substantive vote. And I think we came to over 60 different ways that you could have this when you factor in that there'd be a vote north and south of the border. And we whittled it down to three that we think are plausible and worth considering. So one we call the maximum model. And that's really where all aspects of a form of United Ireland, or the majority of the shape of United Ireland, and the detail is worked out beforehand. And then you have votes on that package deal. So you have one referendum at the end of the process when everything's really been worked out as much as possible. And then we have two other models, and these would involve two different referendums. So in the second model, referendums would take place on the principle of unification, so whether or not you want a United Ireland, and there would be some information on the process that would happen if people voted yes. So you wouldn't have the final detail, but you'd have an idea of what was going to come next in terms of mapping out a United Ireland. And in this model, if people voted yes at the first referendum, nothing would really change probably for a couple of years, and the details of United Ireland would be worked out, and then you'd have a second referendum on that deal. And then sovereignty would either transfer on that deal, or if agreement couldn't be reached, there would basically be a sort of default United Ireland that you would revert to. And in the third model, it's very similar, but the main difference is that immediately after the first vote, you'd have sovereignty transfer. So the details of United Ireland would be worked out under Irish sovereignty rather than under British sovereignty. And the default arrangements would basically be an interim arrangement. So you would have the default terms come into play after the first referendum, and then you'd have negotiations, and hopefully, if people agreed to the package at the second referendum, those would be the terms that a United Ireland would operate under. And if they didn't agree, you'd just stick with the default terms, and that would be the shape of the United Ireland going forward.
Okay. Conor Kelly, thank you very much indeed for joining us today. I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to revisit the issue again, because it's not likely to come off the political agenda in the UK or Northern Ireland in the near future. In the meantime, I look forward to reading the final version of the report. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.